Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron provides, in a performable format, an eclectic set of tales. Being of the part of the 14th century when the Black Plague broke out in Florence, he also gave a first-hand account of the desolation and destruction it effected, and his writings are generally considered our paramount insight into how the Black Plague transpired and what it entailed in the times before inoculation and modern medicine. Thank you for enduring this brief historical context note. Onward to the reading. I say then that the years of the beatific incarnation of the Son of God had reached the tale of 1348, when in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all the cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence, which, whether disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies, or sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath, by way of retribution for our iniquities, had had its origin some years before in the East, when, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so calamitously had spread to the West. In Florence, despite all that human wisdom and forethought could devise to avert it, as the cleansing of the city from many impurities by officials appointed for the purpose, the refusal of entrance to all sick folk, and the adoption of many precautions for the preservation of health, despite also humble supplications addressed to God, and often repeated both in public procession and otherwise by the devout, towards the beginning of the spring of said year, the doleful effects of the pestilence began to be horribly apparent, by symptoms that showed as if miraculous. Not such were they as in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death, but in men and women alike it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called the cavoccioli. From the two said parts of the body, the cavocciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots, or livid, making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, then minute and numerous. And as the cavocciolo had been and still were an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomever they showed themselves, which maladies seemed set entirely at naught both the art of the physician and of the virtue of the physic. Indeed, whether it was that the disorder was of a nature to defy such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault, besides the qualified, there were now a multitude of both men and women who practiced without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and being in ignorance of its source, failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were those that covered few, but almost all within 3 days from the appearance of the said symptoms, sooner or later died, and in most cases without any fever or any other attendant malady. Moreover, the virulence of the pest was the greater by reason the intercourse was apt to convey it from the sick to the whole, just as the fire devours things dry or greasy when they are brought close to it. The evil went yet further, for not merely by speech or association with the sick was the malady communicated to the healthy, with consequent peril of common death, but any that touched the clothes of the sick, or aught else that had been touched or used by these, seemed thereby to contract the disease. So marvelous sounds that which I have now to relate, that, had not many, and I among them, observed it with their own eyes, I had hardly dared to credit it, much less to set it down in writing, though I had had it from the lips of a credible witness. I say, then, that with such the energy of the contagion of the said pestilence was that it was not merely propagated from man to man, but, what is much more startling, it was frequently observed that things which had belonged once to the sick or the dead of the disease, if touched by some other living creature, not of the human species, were the occasion not merely of sickening, but of an almost instantaneous death, whereof my own eyes, as I said a little before, had cognizance, one day among others, by the following experience. The rags of a poor man who had died of the disease being strewn about in the street, 2 hogs came thither, and after, as is their wont, no little trifling with their snouts, took the rags between their teeth, and tossed them to and fro about their chaps, whereupon, almost immediately, they gave a few turns, and fell down dead, as if by poison, upon the rags which in an evil hour they had disturbed. In which circumstances, not to speak of many others, of a similar or even graver complexion, diverse apprehensions and imaginations were engendered in the minds of such as were left alive, inclining almost all of them to the same harsh resolution, to wit, to shun, and to abhor all contact with the sick and all that belonged to them, thinking thereby to make each his own health secure. Among whom there were those who thought that to live temperately and avoid all excess would count for as much as a preservative against seizures of this kind. Wherefore they banded all together, and, disassociating themselves with others, formed communities in houses where there were no sick, and lived a separate and secluded life, which they regulated with utmost care, avoiding every kind of luxury, but eating and drinking moderately of the most delicate viands and the finest wines, holding conversation with none but one another, lest tidings of sickness or death should reach them, and diverting their minds with music and such other delights as they could devise. Others, the bias of whose minds was in the opposite direction, maintained that to drink freely, frequent places of public resort, and take their pleasure with song and revel, sparing to satisfy no appetite, and to laugh and mock at no event, was the sovereign remedy for so great an evil, and that which they affirmed they also put into practice, so far as they were able, resorting day and night, now to this tavern, now to that, drinking with an entire disregard of rule or measure, and by preference making the houses of others, as it were, their inns, if they but saw in them aught that was particularly to their taste or liking, which they were readily able to do, because their owners, seeing death imminent, had become as reckless with their property as of their own lives, so that most of the houses were open to all comers, and no distinction was observed between the stranger who presented himself and the rightful lord. Thus, adhering ever to their inhuman determination to shun the sick as far as possible, they ordered their life. In this extremity of our city's suffering and tribulation, the venerable authority of laws, human and divine, was abased, and all but totally dissolved for lack of those who could and should have administered and enforced them, most of whom, like the rest of the citizens, were either dead or sick, or so hard-bested for servants that they were unable to execute any office, whereby every man was free to do what was right in his own eyes.